up, we have PS3, which is shown in front.
Can everyone hear me all right if I speak like this? Okay. Okay, so the title of DS3 is the project, or project, as you see with the italics. We begin from the position that architecture as product is independent of its realization. There's a distinction between building and what is projected from design and the projects of architecture. That's why architecture historically has not become simply a practice or a product that's made, but a project in itself. I'll explain this in the way that we see it as both noun and verb. What we mean by that is, as noun, we define it as a strategy on whose basis something must be produced or shown. So we kind of mean that it speaks to and of a future, but also a means to get there. And by project as verb, we speak of the act of projecting onto something, projecting onto a future, an act that defines a political intentionality. Okay, and with this aspect, it defines a precondition for your engagement with the city. Bit of context to that. I mean, until kind of the 15th century, there was no distinction between architecture as project and architecture as product, between an idea and between the building that was made. And then certain architects and thinkers, such as Alberti and Vignola from the 15th century, started to define the distinction between the concept of architecture, the concept of what was projected onto space, and what the building was in itself. In that way, architecture became a sort of knowledge, and this architectural knowledge was developed through projects, even if the building wasn't necessarily built at the end of it. For example, here, the project became a means to give a collective knowledge that is, what we say, irreducible to what could be realized in the form of the building, i.e. more than a sum of its parts. I mean, this drawing changed the entire way we see a city, even if it was a project rather than a building being made. Whereas in the verb sense, in terms of establishing a precondition to engage in the city, if you look at No Stop City, they established a precondition and they explored that through looking at the city and how it could be projected forward. We look to the competition and the open call and moments in which architects have been called to project forward in a certain scenario as the intellectual device to rethink both the meaning and instrumentality of architecture. Some of the most important avant-garde, forward-thinking ideas actually were responses to open calls, were responses to competitions that didn't necessarily have a building being made at the end. A lot of speculation. For example, the Manifesto by Corbusier on a contemporary city was actually a response to an open call in 1923. The Eiffel Tower was a temporary structure, a response to a call that was then obviously remained, still around. And the same story goes for East German Pavilion, which was then reconstructed. And for Pompidou Center, which was a response to an open call, some of the most important projects that really shifted the discipline. Parc de la Villette still is a perfect example of this tension between what can be imagined, what can be produced. During the situation of the competition itself, obviously the Schumi project won, and there was also the OMA entry, which is now almost more revered and more kind of loved. And in an interview with the judge for the competition itself, they were asked why did Koolhaas not win, and she simply responded, it simply couldn't be. And from that, we kind of take quite a lot of inspiration in that the failure of La Villette in a certain way was that it had to be realized, and it couldn't kind of amount to the amount of projection that was placed on it, whereas the OMA project, that never had to happen, is then more revered and people are more nostalgic about it, etc. So it's kind of an example of a tension that we're looking at. Going on to site, last year we looked at Rotterdam. We looked at how it was a tabula rasa condition post-war with an entirely new project placed upon the city. A lot of imagination to a certain extent, but what we would call a lack of success. A set of random objects without any interaction with the public sphere, that kind of don't speak to each other, just kind of sit there spectacularly on this tabula rasa condition. And we looked at how we could respond to that, not necessarily by solutions, but by antagonisms, by exposures, by projects that would either propose something forward as I said, would antagonize, would respond to the situation within this tension of what is possible and what might not be. This year we're going to Venice. This is landscape of Venice. Almost looks like how it was probably found, but I think it's just down the road from the main island. And we see Venice as place of ultimate imagination. I mean, it was born of exodus from Roman Empire, escaping Attila the Hun to the most hostile landscape possible, precisely because it wasn't wanted by anyone else. That's why people kind of fled there. We kind of see it as the ultimate kind of crisis leading to imagination, leading to some kind of mythical result of what we see today. We see this as an entire architectural object. It is not a set of urban space. It is one thing rising from this delta landscape. And I guess what we know, the kind of tropes you can kind of roll out about it, obviously a gateway to east to west. Obviously the fact that it was between these has led to both its imperial power and also the production of its own image. This is an image of these horses that were stolen from Constantinople, almost to declare the Republic of Venice as kind of the winner in that imperial battle at the time. And they were displayed on the Basilica di San Marco to kind of prove in the production of Venetian images that it was the new imperial power. And actually this photo is during World War I, when exactly the same horses were taken down from the Basilica in order to hide them, because that was such an important symbol of the image of Venice that needed to be saved. So the city kind of instrumentalized architecture as spectacle, not so much like imperial cities like Rome before. It kind of played a new game that we will develop later. And it took on a mythical identity, really. Neither was one place or another in this east and west, kind of grabbing images from all over the place to kind of make its mythical image. And obviously we see that as like a beautiful place, but it's a paradigm of both a rise and a fall. Like, it's a perfect example of globalization if we look at globalization not as something in the past 50 years, but something that's been going on 500 years, and how that enabled imperial power and how it led to a fall in itself. But we're not like lamenting this fall as such. I mean, it's important to remember that we're not just romanticizing it. I'll kind of develop that later. But the importance of Venice is kind of perfectly defined in this quote. More than any other political entity of the early modern period, Venice shaped the visual imagination of political thought, just as she instructed Europe in the idea of statehood. So she taught how to give that idea pictorial form through the figuration of the state and how that then would resonate within the culture. Venice personified, or the mythical image of Venetia, which we'll talk about later, is probably the most influential figure to shape an entire world's view on one or on the city in the whole of modern history. So we're kind of tackling that. Do you want to?
And of course, what we're going to study and where are we going is not anymore the city, this third Rome, the city that is battling against the Roman Empire. It's not anymore the city that is the bell tower, exactly where it was and as it was, to preserve its unique and its corpse, its very firm identity. But it's the city that we see every day, the city we experience and we will experience also in our field trip, is a city that is continuously building an image in a different way. Somehow this image became sort of two-dimensional, so it's a city that continuously needs restoration. And the only attempt of modernity are the billboards and the scaffolding that we can see. And those even show the image of the city, the two-dimensional image of the city. And so in the sense that this is the success led to a sort of failure. And exactly connecting to what Charlotte was saying about the city of the compromise, is exactly San Marco Square is the square of the compromises, where all those styles and those layering are coexisting in the same spot. And this is also the place where that stages a lot of different rituals during time, both civic and religious. And nowadays it's actually often the rituals of our time, the rituals of 21st century. So as we were seeing the people who were walking around the square, we can see people exactly using the same path, the same water entrance, going towards the Basilica in the Venta.
This is tourists.
Exactly, so very beautiful image. But these conditions are actually modifying the Venice and the landscape of the city, also in a matter of scale. So there's the problem of the big ships that are crossing the canal every day is exactly the result of the 30 million tourists that are crossing the city every day. And so what we are interested in reading the city is this shift from the reading of the city as a unique core, as a singular subject, and reading the city through different subjects, to the subject that as we will do in our trip, are passing through the city. So as the tourists, the residents, the students, but also like migrants there are like, in 2010 they were saying there were like 10,000 migrants crossing the lagoon. So those are the people, and those are this unfolding this unique architectural subject through the subject and passing through it.
Yeah. And I guess it's important to say that, yeah, it's not just the migrant situation in Venice. I mean, yeah, 5 years ago there was 4 to 8 people found per day trying to smuggle on cargo ships, and it's just a perfect example of how kind of even attention and imagination on Lampedusa, on certain places that are famous for kind of being a political state, like a stage on which certain political forces are happening, actually the same processes are happening in the most unexpected places. I think the kind of complexity of Venice asks a lot. It's really heavy. We need to do a lot of research and a lot of understanding in order to even begin to respond to the city. I've showed here Teatro del Mondo, mainly because it's one of the few kind of successful responses, and Rossi knew Venice. I mean, he lived there and worked there, and he knew it very well. The city kind of will exercise a lot of our skills on a lot of layers. I mean, not just spatial, obviously aesthetic, but social and political. And it's not just indulgent. I mean, I think uncovering a politics that happens in an unexpected place can often lead to a much deeper understanding of a global situation than going to the most obvious sites of struggle. And it should just, before we read that, it should be said that like Fra lived there for 7 years. I was living there for 1 year. I was squatting there for a whole year. I was involved in migrant politics activism when I was there, and also like No Grandina against the ships and blah blah blah. So we have a huge kind of way of interacting with the